There are people who do not just live one life, but are forced to carry two lives at the same time. And John Obi Mikel is one of them, a man who steps onto the pitch with a calmness that borders on coldness, yet inside carries fears that cannot be put into words. Sleepless nights, moments when his heart is gripped by news about his family back home in Nigeria, a place where a single phone call can change everything, where his father was once kidnapped and his life placed in the hands of strangers. And while most of the world only sees him as a disciplined, quiet defensive midfielder who always does his job, they never know that every step he takes is sometimes pulled by the fear of losing loved ones, that there are matches he has to play with his mind torn in two, one part trying to maintain absolute focus, the other haunted by what might be happening thousands of miles away. And what matters is not that he does not feel fear, but that he does not allow himself to collapse, does not allow himself to leave his position, because he understands that there are responsibilities that cannot stop, roles that no one else can replace. And so he continues, silently, persistently, like someone who has accepted that his life will always be split between light and darkness that no one truly sees. And in that silence, a solid career is gradually built, not loud, but enduring. With more than a decade wearing the Chelsea shirt and over 370 matches, Mikel becomes an indispensable part of the team's system, winning the biggest titles any player could dream of, including the UEFA Champions League season 2011-2012, 2 Premier League titles, 4 FA Cups, and 1 Europa League, while also playing an important role in maintaining balance in midfield during the club's most successful periods. At the national team level for Nigeria, he wins AFC 2013 and an Olympic bronze medal in 2016, becoming captain and a symbol of a generation. And although not a goal scorer or the center of the spotlight, he is still recognized as one of the most consistent and reliable defensive midfielders in Africa, someone whose value lies not in dazzling moments, but in the ability to hold an entire system together over many years with rare mistakes. Before moving further into the pressure-filled journey he endured in silence, press subscribe and leave a heart as a way to show respect to a man who carried so much without anyone noticing. Because what you are about to see is not just a football story, but a life torn between responsibility and fear, and how he kept moving forward without ever truly resting. In a place thousands of miles away from the bright stadiums of Europe, where the name John Obi Mikel was unknown, his story did not begin with dreams, but with fear. In the city of Jos in Nigeria, a land where instability is not unusual, but part of daily life, where children do not grow up with a sense of safety, but with the sounds of tension, worry, and things that could happen at any moment without warning. And in that space, Mikel did not have a true childhood. He was born into a large family where meals were not always enough, and attention had to be divided among too many people. His father worked tirelessly to sustain life, each day a silent battle against economic pressure, and from a very young age, Mikel saw that exhaustion in his father's eyes. Understood that life was not as easy as people say, that to survive, sometimes one must carry more than they are capable of, and that left him without the chance to be weak, without space to cry when afraid, without anyone to run to when things became overwhelming. Because in such a family, everyone was trying to stay standing, and no one could carry another's pain. Those days had no grand dreams, no clear plans for the future. Only a vague feeling that if things continued like this, life would never change. And football came not as a romantic passion, but as the only escape, the only thing that made him feel he could step beyond the limits of his circumstances, on dusty roads, on empty lots where children gathered to play with whatever they had. Mikel began to touch the ball as a natural reflex, not to become a star, but simply to forget reality for a moment. And in those brief moments, he found something life had never given him, a sense of control, a sense that at least one thing in this life belonged to him. But even as football became essential, the pressure did not leave, because as he grew, he understood that to escape, he had to go further than anything he had known, had to leave his family, leave the only place he called home, and step into a completely unfamiliar world where there were no familiar faces, no protection, only himself facing every challenge. And that was not an easy choice. But in his situation, it was the only one, because staying meant accepting a life that would never change, while leaving, though risky, was still a fragile chance to rewrite his destiny. And so, while other children were still sheltered, Michael had to learn to stand on his own, to hide his fear, to stay silent even when filled with instability, because he understood that if he stopped, if he let those emotions pull him down, no one would come to save him. No one would walk forward in his place, and that is where part of who he became began to change. Quietly, not clearly visible, but deep enough to follow him for the rest of his life, turning him into someone the world would later see as calm, cold, and never losing control, without knowing that all of that was not instinct, but the result of the childhood that taught him that in an unsafe world, the only way to survive is to never show that you are afraid. And then the day to leave came, without a clear milestone, without a complete farewell, just a morning when the boy understood he could not stay any longer. That if he wanted to change his life, he had to step away from the place that raised him, leave his family before he was ready, carry everything he had not. Luggage, not money, but fear, responsibility, and a fragile hope that things would get better. And so John Obi Mikel left home, left familiar faces, left the only place that made him feel he belonged, to enter a completely different world, where there was no family protection, where every day began with competition and ended with elimination. Football academies were not dreamlands, but cold environments where only the strong survive, where a small mistake could get you replaced, where children like him had to grow up faster than their age just to not be left behind. There, no one asked if he was okay, no one cared if he missed home, because everyone was busy fighting for themselves. And in such a space, emotions became a luxury, something that if held too long would weaken you. And Mikel gradually understood that to move forward, he had to hide everything inside, solve every problem on his own without relying on anyone, from the smallest daily struggles to the larger pressures of proving himself every day. No one stood up to protect him. No one said he was good enough. All he had was silence and a determination that could not break. Long training sessions, comparisons, moments standing aside watching others get chosen, all slowly eroded the remaining innocence, replaced by someone who knew how to control himself, keep distance, survive without depending on anyone. And in that process, an important part of who he became was formed, not from victories, but from having to stand up alone when no one helped, from nights lying alone, missing home but unable to call because he did not want to worry his family, from moments when he felt he could not endure anymore but had to continue because there was no other choice. Gradually, he stopped reacting strongly to difficulties, stopped showing fear, stopped seeking comfort, replaced by a growing silence, a way of existing where everything is kept inside, unspoken, unshared, endured quietly while moving forward, and that silence would later become what the world sees when he stands on the pitch. A player who does not panic, does not waver, always calm even in the most tense moments. But no one understands that calmness is not natural, but the result of years of facing everything alone at too young an age, when leaving was not just a career step, but a trade-off, a part of childhood left behind for a chance to move forward. And from that moment, the boy did not just leave home, but left behind his most vulnerable self, becoming someone else, someone whose emotions are no longer shown outwardly, but exist like quiet waves beneath the surface, unseen but always there, shaping every step that follows. And while he was learning to survive in a world that did not allow mistakes, a seemingly small detail quietly happened, yet enough to follow him for the rest of his life. When his name was written incorrectly on a registration list, from Michael to Michael, a simple error. No one thought it mattered, no one stopped to fix it. No debate, no chance to choose again, and no one asked his opinion. Because in such an environment, things like names sometimes do not belong to the person who carries them, but to the system around them. And so the name Michael stayed, not because he chose it, but because he had no right to refuse. And that small thing touched something deeper, a feeling he had grown used to since leaving home, that his life was being shaped by external forces, that decisions were made without him, and all he could do was accept, not because he agreed, but because there was no other choice. At first, he might not have thought much about it, because larger things were happening. Training sessions, pressure, constant worry about whether he was good enough. But over time, as the name Michael was called more often, appeared on shirts, documents, in comments from coaches and teammates, it became part of him, not a chosen part, but one assigned, reflecting a larger reality, that his life was not built entirely by what he wanted, but by what he had to accept. In a world where everything changes quickly, where he must constantly adapt to avoid being left behind, stopping to resist something like that seemed impossible, because resistance meant losing time. And in an environment where every second matters, where others are ready to replace you at any moment, acceptance becomes the only way to keep moving. And so a habit forms, quietly but powerfully influencing future decisions. He learns not to question too much, not to try to control what is beyond reach, but to focus on what can be done now. And that helps him survive, helps him move forward, but also takes away another part, the part that wants to decide his own life. Looking back, the name Michael is not just a typo, but a symbol of a journey where many things happened without his choice, from leaving family, entering a harsh environment, to being swept into decisions larger than himself, and each time he learns that life is not always fair, that there are things you must accept even if you do not want to, and that strength sometimes lies not in changing circumstances, but in continuing through them without collapsing. Gradually, the awareness of not controlling his own fate no longer panics him, but becomes part of how he sees the world. A calmness that is somewhat cold, an acceptance that everything can change without warning, and the only thing he can do is remain standing through those changes, not swept away, not broken. And from there, a person becomes more clearly formed, not someone who controls life, but someone who can endure it. A small difference in words, but a huge emotional difference, because from that moment, he no longer seeks certainty, no longer waits for things to go his way, but prepares to face the unexpected and continue regardless of whether he has a choice. Then one day, when he thought he had grown used to not controlling important things in life, a much bigger event struck, pulling him into the center of a battle he did not start. When his name suddenly appeared in international headlines, linked with two giants of English football, Manchester United and Chelsea FC, one claiming to have signed him, the other insisting he belonged to them, and in a very short time, a young man who had not fully understood the professional world was placed in the middle of a dispute so large that even experienced people would struggle to handle it calmly. What followed was no longer just football, but law, money, power, negotiations behind closed doors, headlines, endless commentary from fans and experts, and at the center of it all was him, someone with almost no voice, no right to explain, and no chance to defend himself against what was being said. The media began crafting narratives, different versions of the same event, and in many of those stories, he was no longer a person with his own circumstances, fears, and pressures, but a character in a battle between two powers, a name pulled back and forth between claims accusations, and agreements he did not control, creating a pressure very few people his age could understand, because it was not just about proving himself on the pitch, but surviving a storm of public opinion where every word, every decision was analyzed, exaggerated, sometimes distorted. While others debated about him, he had to ask himself where he truly belonged, not legally, but personally. Because when life is pulled by such forces, the sense of self becomes blurred, as if he were just part of a much larger game. There were moments he might have wanted to speak, to explain, to say he was not what people claimed, that he was not controlling these events. But in such an environment, his voice was not strong enough to rise above the noise, and so, like many times before, he chose silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because speaking would change nothing. And in that silence, he kept moving, training, preparing for matches as if that were the only way to keep from being swept away. The pressure came not only from outside, but from within, from facing the reality that his career was being decided by others, that the biggest turning points in his life were not in his hands, something that could make anyone feel powerless, especially at such a young age. But in that situation, something else formed, an adaptation not everyone notices. He learned to survive complexity, not react too strongly to change, remain steady even as everything shifts, and most importantly, accept that there are battles he cannot control but must still go through. When everything finally reached a conclusion, and he officially moved forward with Chelsea FC, what remained was not just a contract or career step, but the mark of a period where he was placed in a battle not his own, forced to grow faster, to understand the world in a way no one wishes, and from then on, he no longer saw football the same, not just as an opportunity, but part of a larger system where survival sometimes requires accepting unfairness, staying silent when wanting to speak, and continuing even when the path is not fully chosen by you. When the noise of that dispute faded and he officially wore the blue of Chelsea FC, many thought everything was finally stable, that John Obi Mikel had entered a new life focused on football and success. But reality was more complex, because arriving in Europe was not the end of pressure, but the beginning of a different kind, more subtle, more persistent, harder to see. In a team full of stars where attention goes to goals and brilliance, his role was elsewhere. Not glamorous, but essential. A defensive midfielder, the one in between everything, breaking attacks, controlling tempo, doing things that if done well go unnoticed, but if done wrong are immediately seen. In that role, he realized his career would not be measured by applause, but by consistency, doing the same job again and again across matches, weeks, seasons, without many moments to shine in ways people remember. There were matches he played perfectly, made no mistakes, held the midfield strong, yet left without mention, because what he did was expected, part of the system rather than standout. And gradually he became the kind of player only noticed when absent. The pressure was not to be the best, but to never drop. Because in a club like Chelsea, with constant competition, holding a place required near-perfect consistency, no room for extended bad days, no space to lose focus, forcing him to maintain high concentration over long periods, attention not always visible because it builds quietly over time. To many, he lived a dream life. Top league, titles, elite teammates, but inside it felt different. Because success without equal recognition creates a gap, not dramatic disappointment, but a subtle absence, as if being in the right place doing the right thing, yet not fully belonging. There were times he wondered if he could do more, be a different kind of player, more recognized, more praised, but he returned to reality, that his role was needed as it was, that the system depended on him, and so he continued, doing necessary but unremarkable things, accepting that his career would be defined not by brilliance but by long stretches of stability. Titles came, trophies, successful seasons, and from outside it looked perfect. But inside it did not fully fill what had been lost before. Because past experiences do not disappear when the present improves, they remain, quietly shaping perception, making joy never complete. Each success accompanied by an unexplainable silence. In that gap between what the world saw and what he felt, another life formed, quiet but real, where he had to maintain the image of a stable, professional, mistake-free player while carrying unresolved questions, unshared pressures, and a feeling that, despite going far, part of him had never truly been free or complete. Before those inner gaps could be filled, a childhood fear became real when he received news that his father had been kidnapped in Nigeria while he was playing in Europe. A short, stark message with no clarity, no guarantee of safety, just the reality that the man who worked tirelessly for the family was now in the hands of unseen strangers. And in that moment, everything inside him nearly collapsed, as if the world he tried to hold together had been torn apart irreversibly. He had no time to react, no space to break down, because the schedule did not wait, the team did not stop, and in such an environment, leaving immediately was not simple, and he faced a decision no one should face. Between returning to his family in crisis and staying to fulfill his responsibility, and like many times before, he did not truly have a choice. Circumstances decided, forcing him to stay, to play as if nothing happened. He told no one, not teammates, not coaches, not media, understanding that revealing it would complicate things further. And so he carried it through training, matches, every moment where externally he looked like any other player, but internally everything was different. Each touch not just technical but an effort to keep from being overwhelmed. Each pass followed by thoughts returning to his father. Unanswered questions, fear of never speaking again. Days stretched endlessly, not because time slowed, but because each hour felt heavier. Each morning carried the same question, each night no answers, and throughout, he still played, ran, performed his role precisely, as if nothing had changed. There were moments on the pitch when his body acted by habit, tackling, passing, positioning, while his mind was elsewhere, as if existing in two places at once, one on the field, one in an unknown space where he did not know what was happening to his family. No one in the locker room knew, no one saw it in his eyes, because he had learned early how to hide, keep the surface stable despite inner chaos. And that skill helped him survive one of the hardest periods, but also forced him to endure alone. Silence became not just a choice, but a burden, because without sharing, everything accumulated, growing heavier with no release. From outside, he remained the same player, but inside, something changed, not suddenly but deeply, because when fear becomes that real, it reshapes how life is seen, removing innocence and belief that things will be fine, replacing it with readiness for the worst at any moment. Even when the crisis passed and life stabilized, its impact remained, a mark he carried, not always visible but present in his thoughts, reactions, distance from the world, and from then on, he was not just a player maintaining his place, but a person carrying constant worry, a fear embedded within, quiet and enduring. The days after did not end abruptly, but continued into matches where he still played as usual, still held his position at Chelsea FC, still performed with familiar precision. And from the outside, no one could see that he was living in a completely different state, where every minute carried worry about his father's safety far away, where he could do nothing but wait, and that waiting was what wore him down the most. Each match became not just professional duty, but a mental test requiring him to show no instability, ensure teammates noticed nothing. Coaches asked no questions. Media found no weakness, demanding near total self-control, a focus driven not only by will but by fear that if he loosened, everything might collapse unpredictably. In the locker room, his silence took on new meaning, not just personality but protection, a way to keep inner turmoil from spilling out. Because once it did, he did not know if he could hold himself together. Simple questions were answered briefly, enough to maintain the image, but behind them was a constant stream of thoughts returning to the same worry. Media continued as normal, interviews, photos, repeated questions, and he appeared calm, showing no panic, no sign of personal crisis, making it heavier. Because when no one knows, no one asks, and silence becomes accumulating pressure day by day. At night after matches, alone in quiet rooms, thoughts he suppressed all day surfaced, and in those moments he was no longer a professional player, but a son worried about his father, an ordinary person in an unimaginable situation, and the shift between total control on the pitch and total helplessness in life created tension with no release. There was nowhere to express emotion, no one to fully trust, because any leak could worsen things, so he held everything inside until it became part of how he existed, not temporary but a deep habit, a way of living where emotions are not shown, fear not spoken, everything processed alone. Time did not immediately ease things, only made him used to carrying the burden, used to playing while part of his mind was elsewhere, used to not letting anything disrupt his role. And that familiarity made the burden harder to notice, blending into who he was. Gradually, people saw him as a model of stability, rarely shaken, rarely losing control, and that was true, but they did not understand that stability came not from ease, but from years of enduring unseen struggles, from holding himself together in situations where others might have collapsed, and in those days, silent endurance became not a choice, but a defining trait, something that would follow him not just through that period, but through the years ahead, as more challenges came, and he once again faced them the only way he knew, silently and moving forward. But then, just when he thought he had learned how to endure, had grown used to carrying fear while still moving forward, life once again repeated that very pain in a more cruel, deeper way. When the news of his father being kidnapped for the second time arrived, no longer a shocking surprise like the first time, but a much heavier feeling, because this time he understood better than anyone how long it could last, how bad it could become, and most importantly, he knew that he would still have to stand there, unable to do anything but wait. John Obi Mikel was no longer the confused young man he once was. He had experience. He knew how to maintain calm on the outside, but that very understanding made the fear more vivid, no longer vague, but present in every thought. Every moment he tried to focus on the match while his mind was pulled back home, where everything was happening beyond his reach. This time, the pressure didn't just return. It brought with it what remained from before, stacking on top of each other, making each passing day a greater challenge. Because he was not only facing a new crisis, but also the memory of the old one. The sense of helplessness he had once felt, the fear that everything could end in a way he could not accept, and in that situation, once again, he had to make a choice, or more accurately, accept a familiar path, continue playing for the national team, continue wearing the colors he was always proud of, step onto the field while inside another battle was unfolding. A battle with no clear rules, no fixed timeline, and no guarantees of the outcome. When the national anthem played, when millions watched the match with belief and expectation, he stood there, as he had many times before. Steady posture, eyes forward, but inside, nothing was stable. Every sound, every moment seemed to stretch longer than usual, because he knew that just one piece of new information, one call, one message, could change everything instantly. The match went on, and he still played the way people were used to seeing. No panic, no major mistakes, still fulfilling his role. But the cost of that stability was unseen, because to maintain it, he had to suppress almost all his emotions, had to detach himself from what was happening in his mind, had to create distance between himself and his fear in order to keep moving, keep passing, keep completing the tasks the team needed. When the match ended, when the final whistle blew and people began talking about the result, the performance, the tactical details, He could no longer keep everything inside, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't anymore. And that was when the truth came out, no longer hidden, no longer covered up like before. And when it was spoken, when people learned what he had gone through during that time, the previous silence suddenly felt heavier, as if everything he had held back had finally found its way out. But speaking about it did not immediately make things easier, because what he had experienced did not disappear just because it was known. The exhaustion did not fade simply because others understood more, and the mental fatigue could not be erased with a single confession. The reality was that after everything, he still had to continue, still had to return to the familiar rhythm, to training sessions, matches, responsibilities that could not stop, but this time something had changed. Not in the way he played, but in the depth of how he felt everything. Because when a person faces the same pain more than once, it no longer remains just an event, but becomes a part of life, something that is always there, whether spoken or not. The exhaustion did not come only from what had happened, but from having to maintain strength for too long, from having to stay upright while inside. There were already too many cracks, and even though he kept going, kept moving, kept the image of a professional player that people trusted, something inside had changed forever, a part that understood there are things in life that cannot be controlled, prevented, or avoided, and the only thing one can do is learn to live with them, carry them, without letting them drag you down, even if that means continuing to endure in ways not everyone can see or understand. After everything that had happened, when the storm temporarily settled and life gradually returned to its familiar track, John Obi Mikel's career continued to move forward as if nothing could stop it. And then came a night in Europe, where the lights shone brighter than anywhere else, where the dreams of millions of players converged. He stood on the field in the UEFA Champions League final with Chelsea FC, a match that history would recall many times, a moment any player would want to experience at least once in their life. Everything unfolded with intensity, tension, and no room for error. And throughout that match, he did exactly what he always did. Not flashy, not memorable in the obvious way, but steady enough to keep the system from breaking, calm enough not to be swept away by the pressure of the moment, and when the final whistle blew, when the penalty shootout ended and Chelsea became champions of Europe, he stood among the cheers, among teammates embracing an overwhelming joy, among the tears of victory, and from the outside, it looked like the peak, the confirmation that all efforts had been rewarded. But inside, it did not feel entirely like that. The joy was there, but not complete, as if a part of him could not fully reach that moment, as if what he had gone through before still remained, not disappearing just because he was standing at the pinnacle of European football. Memories of days playing in anxiety, sleepless nights waiting for news from home, moments when he felt stretched between two worlds. None of it disappeared. It only moved into the background, quietly existing as a layer no one else could see. The years that followed brought more success, more trophies, more milestones any player would dream of, from the Premier League to the FA Cup, from big victories to consistent seasons, and he remained an important part of it all. Still the one who kept the rhythm, protected the midfield, ensured things did not fall into chaos. But the more he achieved, the more complex the feeling inside became. Because when success could not erase what had been endured, it no longer felt like relief, but became another layer over life, one that from afar seemed perfect, but not enough to fully cover the cracks beneath. There were moments in the locker room after matches, when everyone celebrated, when laughter echoed and stories of victory were retold. He was still there, participating, smiling, but a part of him stood apart, observing, as if not entirely belonging to that shared joy, not because he did not appreciate what he had achieved, but because certain experiences had changed how he felt everything, making joy no longer simple, no longer a complete emotion, but something mixed between pride and emptiness, pressure did not disappear with success, it only changed form. From proving himself to maintaining his position, staying at the top, not being allowed to decline. And while others saw trophies as proof of success, he felt more clearly than ever that behind each one was a journey not always worth celebrating, that there were things sacrificed that could not be regained, parts of life that passed quietly, unseen and unacknowledged. Success, in his case, was not a destination that brought relief, but a state he had to learn to live with, just as he had learned to live with fear, with pressure, with things beyond control. It did not erase what had happened, did not make things emotionally easier, but only created a distance between what the world saw and what he truly felt. And within that distance, his life continued in a way few understood. A life where success did not equal happiness, trophies did not equal release, and the moments considered greatest were not enough to fill the emptiness formed long before. Yet still he continued, still moved forward, still held his role, not because everything had become perfect, but because it was the only way he knew how to exist in a life where everything, from pain to success, came without asking whether he was ready. And then, when trophies no longer brought the fullness people imagined, John Obi Mikel's life gradually revealed a reality not everyone could see. He was not only living the life of a footballer in Europe, but simultaneously existing in another world thousands of miles away, where his family still faced instability, dangers he could not control, and that parallel existence kept him constantly stretched, like a string that could never loosen. In Europe, in Chelsea FC's colors, he was part of a system, a professional player with a clear schedule, training sessions, matches, travel, a life structured down to every detail, where everything was planned, organized, somewhat predictable. But in Nigeria, his family's life was entirely different, unstable, without guarantees, where an ordinary day could suddenly turn into an emergency, where those he loved most could be in danger without him being there. And that contrast created not just a geographical distance, but an emotional one he could never fully bridge, no matter how hard he tried. There were days he woke up in London preparing for an important match, but his mind was filled with thoughts of family, wondering if everything back home was okay, about things he could not see, could not verify, only imagine. And those imaginations were sometimes heavier than reality because they had no limits, no end, and no one to confirm that everything was fine. Yet, no matter how many thoughts filled his mind, when he stepped onto the field, he had to push everything aside, had to focus on the match, his position, his responsibilities, and that required an almost complete separation between two parts of his life, one as a player, one as a son, and neither could be neglected. He could not choose to live only for his career, because behind him was a family, people who had sacrificed for him, and that responsibility was not something he could set down when wearing his jersey, but at the same time he could not abandon his career to return completely, because that very career was the only way he could protect his family in the way he could. And so he was placed in a position with no perfect choice, where every decision came with a lack and incompleteness he had to accept. The sense of division was not always obvious. Sometimes it appeared as a quiet gap between moments when he sat alone after a match, when the noise had faded and thoughts returned, when he looked at his phone waiting for a message from family, when he realized he was in a place where everyone talked about football while his mind was somewhere entirely different. And those moments made him realize he did not fully belong to either world. Not completely part of life in Europe, but no longer fully part of life in Nigeria either, existing somewhere in between, in a state without a clear name. But instead of trying to resolve that division, he learned to live with it, to maintain both roles at once, not because he believed it was the best, but because it was the only possible way. He continued playing, maintaining form, meeting expectations, while also staying connected with family, ensuring things back home were cared for, even if he could not be there physically. It required a balance with no clear formula, a flexibility in how he allocated time, energy, and emotion, and sometimes that balance was never perfect. There were always moments when one side lacked, one side was missed, and he could only accept that he could not always do both well. Over time, living between two worlds became not unusual, but the default state, part of life he no longer questioned, no longer tried to change, but simply tried to do his best within each situation. And in that state, he kept moving forward, not with the feeling that everything was resolved, but with the understanding that some things would always be there, always coexist, and his task was not to eliminate them, but to learn not to let them break him, even if that meant continuing to live in a division with no clear end. And then, between two worlds pulling him in different directions, between constant flights, non-stop matches, and worries that never disappeared, John Obi Mikel finally found a space where he could somewhat relax, not on the field, not in the locker room, but within his own small family, where he did not have to maintain the image of a professional player, did not have to control every expression, every word, where he could be a normal person, a husband, a father. And that, however simple it might seem, became the most valuable thing he had. His relationship with his wife was not loud, not publicly displayed, not tied to headlines or repeatedly told stories, but existed quietly, steadily, like the way he lived, not needing attention to prove its value, only needing enough strength to endure the hardest times. And in a life where too much was beyond control, having someone beside him, someone who understood the pressures he never spoke about, someone who did not demand explanations, became a support he had never had before. When his two daughters were born, life changed once again, not in a way that increased pressure as many might think, but in a way that brought a different feeling, one he had not experienced in a long time, the feeling of being in a safe space where what mattered was no longer match results or media reactions, but small moments, evenings at home, laughter unrelated to any external pressure. In those moments, he did not need to be the one controlling the team's rhythm, did not need to think about tactics or performance, did not need to worry about whether he was good enough in others' eyes. Because in his daughter's eyes, he was not a player, just a father. And that, in a way, gave him a sense of completeness football had never provided. Family gradually became the only place where he could truly relax. Not in the sense of having no worries, but in not having to hide what he felt, not maintaining an image, not keeping distance, and in a life where most of the time he had to control himself, suppress emotions, live under observation, having such a space was not just comfort, but a necessity to keep going. That is why he always tried to keep his private life away from the media. Not to completely isolate it, but because he understood that once what belonged to family was exposed, it would no longer remain intact. It would be analyzed, judged, possibly affected in ways he could not control, and that was something he did not want to repeat. Maintaining privacy was not always easy, especially as a high-level player, where every detail could become public. But he still tried, by limiting appearances, not sharing too much, creating a clear boundary between work and personal life. A boundary he knew he needed to protect what remained after everything he had been through. And in that process, he did not seek perfect balance. Because he understood his life might never be fully balanced, there would always be things leaning to one side, times when one part took more than the other. But what he sought was a state where he could continue, move forward without feeling like he was losing too much. There were days after intense matches when he returned home and simply sat there, not saying much, not doing anything special, just being present, and in that presence he felt something rare before, a quiet, not accompanied by worry, a stillness not filled with heavy thoughts, and even if it did not last forever, even if it did not erase what had happened, it was enough to keep him going, enough to return to what awaited ahead with a little more ease, a little more steadiness. Family, in his case, was not an addition to life, but the only part that brought a sense of normalcy, a place where he was not divided between two worlds, did not have to choose between responsibility and emotion, but could exist more fully, even if only for a short time. And in those moments, he began to understand that even if life might never become easy, even if hardships might continue, there were still things he could hold on to, protect, rely on, not to escape reality, but to have enough strength to face it again. And then, after all the years devoted to the field, after trophies, matches, pressures unseen by many, John Obi Mikel came to a decision that from the outside might look like a normal career transition, but for him was deeply personal, a choice not driven by performance or inability, but by a clear realization that continuing at the same pace, in the same environment, might cost him more than he could keep. Leaving Chelsea FC was not explosive, not filled with loud farewells or grand statements, but happened quietly, somewhat privately, like most things in his life, yet carried a clear meaning that he had reached his limit in an environment he had given so much to. During his years at Chelsea, he had become an essential part of the team, not in the way of the most talked-about stars, but as someone always there when needed, always maintaining structure, ensuring nothing collapsed, and so leaving was not giving up, but a conscious step back, a way to protect what remained of himself. When he moved to other leagues, less intense environments, where the spotlight was not on every detail, where mistakes were not magnified into headlines, it was not a sign of decline, but an adjustment, a way to find a pace he could better control. Those places did not carry the same weight as the Premier League, not the same media intensity, not the same pressure to always be at the top, and in that space, he began to feel a change, not in ability, but in how he approached life, no longer having to stretch himself daily to meet ever-growing expectations, no longer maintaining a state of perfection he no longer felt part of, but instead a slower rhythm, a space to reflect, to look back, to exist without being pulled too fast. Slowing down his career was not easy, especially for someone used to competing at the highest level, but for him, it was not abandoning ambition, but redefining what truly mattered. Because after everything, the pressures, the moments of having to stand firm when inside he was not, he understood that if he kept chasing external demands, he might lose himself, and that was unacceptable. Mental health, something he rarely had time to consider before, became a clearer priority, not publicly stated, but reflected in his choices. How he spent time, where he chose to be, what he chose to do and not do. Family once again became central, not just a place to return after matches, but shaping how he continued his path, because after so many moments when he could not be with those who mattered most, prioritizing family was no longer emotional but necessary, a way to make up for what had been missed. He no longer chased the spotlight as before, no longer sought attention, no longer tried to prove anything to the world because, at some level, he understood that what truly mattered was not how others saw him, but whether he could continue living without losing the most important parts of himself. The steps that followed might not have been widely mentioned, might not have appeared in major headlines, but they were no less meaningful, because in each decision, each change, he was building a new way of living, one where he was not completely driven by external forces, but could retain some control, some choice he rarely had before. And even if that path was no longer as bright, no longer brought the same kind of glory, it brought something else, a relief he had long searched for, a sense that for the first time in years, he was not just existing to meet the world's demands, but living in a way that allowed him to continue without breaking inside. The years that followed moved at a slower pace, no longer filled with bright European nights, no longer with roaring cheers after every victory, and his life gradually moved away from the center of attention he had once been part of, not because he disappeared, but because he chose to step out of that light to preserve what remained of himself. After his peak years, he no longer appeared frequently in public, no longer a name mentioned in every big match, no longer under constant media scrutiny. And to many, that might look like a step back, a closing chapter. But for him, it was necessary, a space he had lacked during years of constant pressure. Life no longer revolved around packed schedules or non-stop travel, but was filled with simpler things, small routines, uninterrupted moments. And within those ordinary things, he found a balance he had never had before. But that quiet was not a sign of a life without turbulence, but the result of what he had endured, because past events did not disappear when the lights faded, they remained, shaping how he saw the world, how he reacted, and how he understood himself. Those experiences changed him in ways not everyone could see, not outwardly, but inside, where reactions were no longer the same, where things that once caused worry were now seen differently, not because they no longer mattered, but because he had been through too much to react like someone untouched by loss or pressure. The quiet remained, but now with a different meaning, not just protection, but part of who he had become, shaped through time, through moments of having to stand when everything else was falling apart. He continued living privately, avoiding unnecessary noise, not to isolate completely, but because he understood the value of quiet, that not everything needed to be shared, not every moment recorded. And in an increasingly noisy world, preserving privacy was not just a choice, but protection. Others might see him less, hear less from him, see him less involved in big narratives. But that did not mean he was absent, only present in a different way, one that did not need external validation. Stability did not mean life had become easy, because it was built on what had come before, on lessons he never forgot, and each day he still carried memories, feelings that once forced change. But instead of letting them pull him down, he learned to let them exist without breaking his balance. Sometimes old memories returned, unclear but enough to remind him of the path he had walked. And in those moments, he understood even more the value of the present, of what he had, of the peace that once felt like a luxury. He no longer tried to become what the world expected, no longer held himself to standards set by others, but chose to continue in his own way, without explanation, without proof, just enough to keep moving without losing what mattered. And even if life might never become completely light, even if the past would always be part of him, he remained there, not as someone untouched, but as someone who had gone through it all and still chose to continue, not because everything was okay, but because he had learned to live with what never truly disappears. And when looking back at that entire journey, from the dusty red roads of Jos to the bright European nights, from a boy growing up in unnamed fear to a man who had gone through more than anyone could see, John Obi Mikel's story was no longer just about football, but about how a person exists when life is never truly easy. How he carried pressures few understood, events never fully told, and still kept moving in silence. His childhood did not give him protection. His early years forced him to leave before he was ready. Major decisions came without choice. Disputes pulled him in as part of something larger. And then personal crises, when fear became reality. When his family faced situations beyond his control, all of it piled up without order, without time to prepare, without a real stopping point. For years, he did not live one life, but two at once. One the world saw, with matches, trophies, moments called success, and another, quieter, heavier, where he was a son, worrying for family thousands of miles away, carrying fear he could not share, and keeping those two lives from colliding became his greatest challenge. There was no one to balance it for him, no formula to make it easier, only persistence, silence, and a will he had to build day by day. What he achieved on the field was real. Trophies, victories, years at the top, all results of relentless effort. But focusing only on that would miss the most important part, because his legacy was not just in trophies, but in how he stood firm with so many reasons to fall, how he kept playing when, inside, he was not steady, how he kept himself from breaking in circumstances no one wished to face. Some players are remembered for goals or highlights, but he was defined by what could not be seen. Matches played while his mind was elsewhere, days pretending everything was fine just to continue. And now, when things had slowed down, what remained was not someone who conquered everything, but someone who kept going despite exhaustion, despite carrying too much, despite parts of life that could never return. He did not stand as a perfect symbol, not a story without cracks, but proof of how much a person can endure without completely falling, how one can continue existing even without always being as strong as others think. And perhaps that is what remains after everything. Not trophies on display, not statistics, but a quiet story of resilience, of continuing even with little energy left, of not giving up even when no one sees the battle being fought, because sometimes a person's value is not in what they achieve when everything is easy, but in how they keep moving when everything becomes too heavy to carry. Looking back at John Obi Mikel's entire journey, what makes people ache is not a lack of glory, but that he achieved so much while paying with deeply human parts few could see. His calm performances at Chelsea FC while his father was kidnapped were not just shocking details, but the clearest proof of how far a person can be forced to divide themselves just to survive. His childhood in Jos, where fear came before dreams, leaving family early, being pulled into disputes between Manchester United and Chelsea without a voice, all show he almost never lived a life of his own choosing. And most painful is that even at the peak with a Champions League title, completeness never came, because memories of loss and pressure never left. Yet in that imperfection, he became admirable. Not because he won, but because he did not fall. For people in the United States, this story carries a practical lesson. Outward success never fully reflects what a person endures inside, and empathy and respect for unseen battles are more necessary than ever. At the same time, it reminds that true strength is not controlling everything, but continuing forward even when life gives no choice. If John Obi Mikel's story makes you think, hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to honor those who keep standing in silence. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where stories that seem glorious will continue to be told with deeper truths.